Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Let's see, how do I start? Let me start by saying, hi, I'm Russ Olsen, and it has been a long time since I've been to a conference. You know, pandemic, being busy at work, a million different things. It's been a long time since I've been together with you and your colleagues. And I was struck today, as I'm always struck when I come to conferences like this, about just how smart and hardworking and well-educated all of you are. I mean that sincerely. And it always raises the question in my mind, you're all incredibly capable people, but you do this. You've chosen to do this thing that we do. Why? Right? What makes you want to do this thing? So I have a different kind of talk for you today because I want to address the why question. And the problem with the why question is it's so big that it's not just hard to answer, it's hard to talk about. So what I want to do is tell you a story. It is a story that's really close to my heart. And it's also a story, I think it's a fun story. If nothing else, we've had a great conference day, great couple of conference days, and we can kind of kick back and listen to kind of a fun story. But I also think that this story has some lessons to teach us, lessons about small things that we can learn from this story about engineering and software, big things, and I also think it has something to say about the why question. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you the story, and then at the end, I'm going to roll back around and try and make the case that this story has little things and great big things to teach us about the work that we do. So here goes. First, the story. It's the summer of 1969, and it's hot. I mean, it's really hot. And sometimes when it gets hot like this, people go a little crazy. Sometimes it feels like the whole world is going crazy. And here in the summer of 1969, there are all kinds of things that are going crazy. In the United States, there's huge and growing and sometimes violent protests against the Vietnam War. Here in Europe, there are protests too. These protests are more about having a fairer society, a more responsive government. At times, in the last year, here in the summer of 1969, the entire country of France has been shut down as students take to the streets, demanding a better education, a fairer society. But it's not just the civil unrest and the heat here in the summer of 1969 that seems a little crazy. It's also the pace of technological development. Because here in the summer of 1969, you can now buy a computer that has not one, not two, but 4 megabytes of memory. Can you imagine that? 4 million bytes of memory. And the price. That memory will only cost you 100,000 US dollars per megabyte. But if you want real crazy here in the summer of 1969, you need to look no further than the Cold War, because here in the summer of 1969, the Cold War has been raging for 25 years. For 2.5 decades, the world has been divided. There's Western Europe and the United States and some other countries on one side, Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, some other countries on the other side. And these two sides have been locked in this not quite peace, not quite war thing for 25 years. In Berlin, at times, the tanks have faced each other across the single street. The guns are loaded, and each side is just waiting for the other side to make the first move, or to make the first mistake, or to sneeze. And you better hope nobody sneezes. You better hope nobody sneezes, because they have thousands of nuclear weapons. We have thousands of nuclear weapons. And let me tell you, no matter which side you're on, if those bombs start flying, we all have about 15 minutes to live. So here in the summer of 1969, we are holding on by our fingernails, living life 15 minutes at a time. But for once, there's something besides the heat and the technology and even the Cold War that is pushing all of the other stories out of the news. It is Apollo, the project to land a person on the moon. But don't get me wrong, Apollo is all about the Cold War. See, in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, the Soviet Union, the Russians, as people still called them, were doing all kinds of remarkable things in space. They launched the first Earth satellite. They put the first person in orbit. They got the first picture of the far side of the moon. Really crappy picture, but it was a picture nevertheless. And the Cold War was like a chess game. They make a move, we have to respond. They make a move, we have to respond. And in particular, the Americans had to do something about the space thing. The Russians were making us look bad. And so John Kennedy was president of the United States at the time. And him and his advisors, they came up with a very simple strategy to deal with the space thing. And it was based on the idea that if you're behind in a race, the way the Americans were behind the Soviets in space, it's better to be behind in a long race than a short race. Why? Because in a long race, you have time to catch up. So Kennedy and his advisors just decided to declare a marathon. Where can we go in space, Kennedy asked. Where can we go that is far away, that'll turn this thing into a marathon? Kennedy's advisor said, well, the moon's pretty far away. Kennedy said, fine, we're going to the moon. Just completely arbitrary goal. We need a deadline. We need a stake in the calendar. 1970 is a nice round number. We are going to the moon by 1970. Just completely arbitrary goal, completely arbitrary deadline. No one here has ever experienced that, have you? So Kennedy got up in front of the US Congress and he said, we are going to take a person from the Earth, we are going to fly them to the moon, we're going to land them on the moon, and we are going to return them to the Earth safely. And a funny thing happened after he made that speech. A funny thing happened, like maybe you'll be walking down the street and you see your friend and you say, hey, have you heard about this moon thing? And your friend would say, yeah, they're going to the moon. And you would say, people have dreamed about going to the moon for thousands of years, and it's going to be, we are the people who are going to go to the moon. It's like, yes, we all know it's about the Cold War. Don't care that it's about the Cold War. We are going to the moon. And it's funny, you could tell that Kennedy, like to Kennedy, this was just a Cold War chess move, right? He didn't care about space, he didn't care about the moon. It was something he had to do to fight the Cold War. But you could tell that he caught some of the excitement, because a few months after he made that first speech, he made a second speech, and in the second speech, he said words to the effect, we choose to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. So how hard is it to go to the moon? Well, so I have this tennis ball. You see this tennis ball? So you got to do this, right? Whenever you're talking about astronomical distances, you have to have a thing, right? So if this is the Earth, this tennis ball, and I've got this little rubber ball. This is about the right size for the moon, if this is the Earth. Now I want you to think about your textbook when you're in school, right? Talking about eclipses or the phases of the moon. They always have a picture. Here's the Earth. Here's the moon, right? You know the picture. Well, I'm here to tell you, that picture is wrong. They're just trying to fit them on the page. The Earth and the moon are not this close. They're not this close. They're not this close. My arms aren't long enough. It would be 2 meters at this scale. Now, the thing is, when Kennedy said, we are going to the moon by an arbitrary deadline, a few people had gone out into space. 1 American and a handful of Russians. You know how far they had made it out into space? Not quite as far as the fuzz on this tennis ball. We hadn't made it out of the fuzz yet, and we're going 2 meters by an arbitrary deadline. It was insane. Now, if you've got this crazy project and this insane deadline, how do you even start? What's the right thing to do to start? Well, I don't know what the right thing to do, but I know what they did, and it was everything all at the same time, right? Let's think of everything we need to do to go to the moon, and we will start doing each one right now. And the prayer is that they're all going to come together and work perfectly together at the last minute, because we all know that's a great engineering strategy. So one of the things they did was they said, hey, what's the simplest version of this thing that we can do right now, right? So we need a prototype. So the final goal is to take a person, fly them to the moon, land them on the moon, return them safely to the Earth. But that's too hard for right now. What can we do right now? How can we make this simpler? Well, obviously, leave the person out of it. People like to breathe, and they don't like the heat and the cold. So if we just send the machine, land it on the moon, and return it safely to the Earth, that has got to be easier. But is that the easiest, the simplest version of this thing? No, of course not. If you are just sending a machine, just fly it to the moon, land it on the moon, and leave it there. Cut the trip in half. That has got to be easier. But is that the simplest, the easiest version of this thing that we could do? Not quite. We need to talk about this word, land, right? What if we redefine land as go screaming in at about 4,000 kilometers an hour, right? That's landing of a sort. We can take some pictures on the way. It'll be good. Thus was born Project Ranger, a project whose goal it was to hit the moon with a spaceship. So Ranger 1 was launched in August of 1961, and it's kind of a weird project, right? The goal is to crash the spaceship. And by that measure, Ranger 1 exceeded expectations, or certainly was ahead of schedule. Ranger 1 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. Ranger 2 did better. It crashed into the Pacific Ocean. Ranger 3, launched a few months later, in all seriousness, did better. Ranger 3 flew all the way out to the orbit of the moon. Moon wasn't there at the time. There was a little navigation problem, 100,000 kilometers. So Ranger 3 just kept right on going into the great beyond. Ranger 3 is still out there. Let's see, Ranger 4 actually hit the moon, but Ranger 4 died on the way to the moon. It was a brick when it hit the moon. That was success? No, not really. Let's see. 5. Ranger 5 was apparently worried about Ranger 3 and joined it in the great beyond. Ranger 6 had a perfect, flawless 3-day journey to the moon. It takes about 3 days to get to the moon. And on the morning of that third day, the people behind Ranger 6 realized that, hey, now the spaceship is falling towards the moon, and it's working, and here we go. Here we're going to get these really close-up pictures of the moon no one's ever seen, and the camera failed. And Ranger 6 went screaming into the moon, blind as a bat. Ranger 7 had a flawless mission to the moon. It actually worked, and it took these pictures closer, closer, until it finally returned this half of picture. And what happened was it took the whole picture, and it was radioing it back when the lights went out. So you can imagine that the people behind Ranger 7 were slapping each other on the back and popping champagne corks when this picture came back, but you can also imagine they were saying, my God, it took us 7 tries and 2 years to do the simplest thing that could possibly work. How are we going to do the whole thing? And the answer is they just kept doing everything all at the same time. So while they were trying to hit the moon with Rangers, they were building these giant going-to-the-moon rockets, but they realized that the giant going-to-the-moon rockets would not be ready in time to train people, in particular to train the astronauts, on the things they needed to do to fly to the moon. So they built a whole different spaceship just to train people. It was called Gemini. It would take 2 astronauts up into orbit, just still in the fuzz, but they could practice the skills they need. They learned a lot from Gemini. One of the things they learned was about the steering rockets. So every spaceship has these little rockets positioned all around it, and they make the ship turn left or turn right, nose up, nose down. It's the kind of thing that airplanes do with flaps and a rudder, there's no air in space, so you need these little rockets. What they discovered in Gemini is what happens when one of those rockets malfunctions and starts firing and will not turn off. And what happens is that your spaceship starts to tumble, slowly at first, but then faster and faster and faster. And what they also discovered is that when this happens, the people inside the spaceship become disoriented enough that they can't see. But what they also discovered is that if you have an astronaut in your tumbling out of control spaceship who can stay calm and work the problem, even though his spaceship is literally spinning out of control, and can find the right buttons to push, even though he can't see what he's doing, this is a survivable accident, and survive they did. That is something to know. While they're trying to hit the moon with Rangers, while they're sending people up in Gemini, they are building these huge workshops, and they're building these huge workshops to have a place to build these gigantic going-to-the-moon rockets. And the end result of that is this. This 35-story monstrosity is a huge, giant rocket that only has one purpose. Its sole purpose is to throw the very pointy bit at the top, see it better in that picture, the very pointy bit at the top at the moon. Because the very pointy bit at the top is the result of yet another project. This is the Apollo mothership. This thing can keep 3 people alive for about 2 weeks in space. It has that big rocket engine on the back so it can blast them back to Earth. It has a heat shield so they can survive re-entry. It has parachutes, and it even floats because it lands on water. It is a marvel of 1960s technology. There's only 2 things wrong with it. Thing number 1 is that it killed its first crew. They weren't even flying in space. They were just practicing on the ground when a fire broke out inside the spaceship. 3 times the ground crew tried to fight their way through the flames and the smoke and the heat to get those people out. 3 times they got driven back. When they finally did get the hatch open, there's no one left to save. But here in the summer of 1969, that was 18 months ago, and we're pretty sure we fixed all the problems with this thing. Pretty sure we fixed the fire problems, but we're in a hurry. The other problem with this thing is with the big rocket engine and the heat shield and everything you need to survive in space and the parachutes and the fact that it floats. It is too heavy to actually land on the moon. It can go from the Earth to the moon, it can circle around the moon, it can come back, but it cannot make the last 80, 90-kilometer journey down to the moon. So for that, we have this. This bizarre-looking thing is a specialized spaceship whose only job it is to take 2 of the 3 astronauts, so one of the astronauts stays with the mothership, take 2 of them down to the surface of the moon, the 80 kilometers or so down to the surface of the moon, let them hang out for a little bit, and then return them to the mothership. Everybody goes home. So the plan is for these 2 spaceships to fly out to the moon carrying these people. This is the crew of Apollo 11. They are the first people to try and land on the moon. The guy, let's see, on your right is Buzz Aldrin. And here's one of the 2 people who's going to try and land on the moon. Buzz Aldrin is one of the world's leading experts in space navigation, right? You can imagine why they brought him along. You're not going to win the Cold War having your astronauts fly off into the great beyond. The guy on the other side is Neil Armstrong. He's the other person who's going to try and land on the moon. We've already met Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong is the astronaut in that out-of-control spaceship who managed to save himself and his crewmate, even though things were going wrong. Can you imagine why they brought him? The guy in the middle is Michael Collins. And Michael Collins is the astronaut who's going to stay in the mothership. So he gets to go to the moon, but not land on the moon. And he has, the worst job in the world, right? And his job is the worst job, well, it's the worst job in the solar system. His job is the worst job, not just because he doesn't get to land on the moon, that's part of it. His job is the worst job because of the what-ifs. What if something happens to the other two on the way down to the moon? What if they land on the moon and can't get back? In that case, Colin's job is to turn around, leave his friends behind, and make the silent, sad, 3-day journey back home. That has got to be the worst job in the universe. It is July 20th, 1969. So Sunday, it's about 1600, 4 p.m. A few days ago, Apollo 11 took off. They've had a quiet 3-day mission to the moon. A couple of hours ago, Aldrin and Armstrong got in this weird-looking machine, and they have been on their way down to the moon ever since. They are about to enter the final 10-minute flight down to the moon. It's a part of the mission that NASA calls powered descent. Back at Mission Control, there is a room full of people getting ready for war. Their job is to watch the data streaming down from that crazy-looking spaceship and be the 3rd, the 7th, the 17th pair of eyes to make sure everything is working, and they are deadly serious. There is an armed guard on the other side of the door. The door is locked. No one is getting in or out of this thing, out of this room, until this thing is over. Many of these people are in their late 20s, their early 30s. They have spent a significant portion of their adult lives getting ready for these 10 minutes. Back on Earth, in the United States and in a few places around the world, the streets are mostly empty. There's very few cars on the streets. Most people are inside, glued to their television, listening to what's going on above the moon. It's right around now in the United States that something weird starts to happen with the cars that are on the road. They start to pull off. On city streets, they find a place to park. On highways, they pull off onto the shoulder. On rural roads, they just stop. The drivers can't drive and listen to their radio, listen to what is going on in the moon, over the moon at the same time. In this very modest house in the city of Philadelphia on the east coast of the United States, a 10-year-old boy and his dad are watching the coverage on TV. It's right around now, it's right around 1600 that the dad gets up from the couch, walks about halfway to the TV, and puts his hand on his head and crouches down. And that is the way he'll stay until this is over. They're watching this guy. This is Walter Cronkite on TV. Walter Cronkite is like the king of US TV news guys. And Cronkite's thing is that nothing upsets him, nothing makes him emotional. He is famous for talking in a calm voice from war zones about what it's like to get shot at and have people drop bombs on you. It is 1605, just right at the beginning of that last 10 minutes flight down to the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin are at 15 kilometers. They've gone through about a quarter of their fuel, and things are not going well. The problem is that their radio isn't really working. Right? They can talk to the ground for a few seconds, and then they get these huge blasts of static, and they don't know where the static is coming from, but it's a real problem because it's also interrupting the data, and they need that 3rd, 7th, 17th pair of eyes to make sure that this thing is working. So they're doing all of the things that you do to fix a radio. They have their heads down, they're changing channels, they're adjusting the antenna. And fortunately, they have time to do that because they are not actually flying the spaceship. There is a new, cool bit of technology flying that spaceship. It is a compact computer. And to get a computer that can do something into a package about this big that only weighs 30 kilograms is just a marvel. But it's also the software running on this computer that is a marvel. It is processing data in real time. It's making life or death decisions. And in fact, the woman mainly responsible for that software, and let me pause here and say that again, the woman mainly responsible for that software has realized that what she does is different than just programming. This is a complex hardware-software system, and it's running in real time. It's running on that tiny little computer, and so she makes up a new name for what she does. So I would like you all to meet Margaret Hamilton, the first software engineer. So the reason they have the computer and Margaret Hamilton software is they are not just trying to generically land anywhere on the moon. They have a very carefully selected pinpoint spot on the moon that they are aiming for. And in the run-up to Apollo 11, there was a lot of controversy about where they should land exactly. On the one side, you have the astronomers and the geologists and people who study the moon. And they're like, yeah, we all know this is all about the Cold War, but this is also the scientific opportunity of a lifetime. We have got to land someplace scientifically interesting. And on the other side, you have the rocket scientists and the engineers and the astronauts. And they're like, sure, whatever, what's scientifically interesting? And the astronomers and the geologists, the people who study the moon, are like, all right, so maybe the bottom of a valley. No, even better, the bottom of a canyon. No, better, the very peak of a mountain. No, even better, the rim of a crater, but you'd have to get really close to the edge. To which the rocket scientists and the engineers, and especially the astronauts, are like, yeah, we're not landing anywhere near any of those places. And in the end, it was the rocket scientists and the engineers, and especially the astronauts, who won the argument, because you're not going to win the Cold War having your little spaceship fall into a crater, right? So the computer is flying Apollo 11 to the flattest, dullest, most geologically uninteresting spot on the moon that NASA can find. It is 1610. 5 minutes into that last 10 minutes of flight down to the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin are down to 11 kilometers. They've gone through 50% of their fuel, and good news, the radio starts working, right? Nobody knows why the radio was acting weird, but now it's working. And you got to believe that maybe Armstrong and Aldrin are taking a breath and looking at each other and thinking, okay, maybe it's going to go well from here, when a display lights up in front of them with the number 1202. Now, 1202 is a message from their computer, and I know, nobody here really understands ancient guidance computers. Certainly I don't, but it turns out there's a formula you can use to convert 1202 into something any modern software engineer with, or maybe, if you're a Java programmer, I'm kind of old school, Their computer is crashing, or at least it's glitching. Armstrong gets on the radio. He said, radio's down the mission control, 1202. What the heck is 1202? There's hundreds of these error codes. There's a moment of frozen horror in that room. What's 1202? There's one guy in that room who knows what 1202 is. His name is Steve Bales, and he knows that 1202 means that the computer is falling behind. It's falling behind all of the things that it's trying to do. But he also knows that Hamilton's software, when that happens, will do the most important things first. And right now, there's only one important thing: fly the spaceship. So Bales has like 2 seconds to make this literally life or death decision. And he's just like, ignore the 1202s, just keep going, pay no attention. Unfortunately, Armstrong and Aldrin can't quite ignore the 1202s. For one thing, there's a lousy user interface design. The 1202 lights up, and they have to physically push a button to clear it. And if they don't, they won't see the next error code, which might be another 1202, or might be 666, which means the engine fell off or something. So they have their heads down, and they are trying to figure out why their computer isn't working, and they're clearing the 1202s. It is 1612, 7 minutes into that last 10 minutes flight down to the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin are all the way down to 600 meters. They've gone through 80% of their fuel. And good news, the computer seems to right itself. The 1202s slow down to almost nothing. And finally, Armstrong has a chance to look up and look out the window. He's got this little triangular window in front of him. Now, they're at 600 meters. If you are flying into London or New York or Copenhagen, and you're at 600 meters, you're getting ready to land, right? Your seatbelt is fastened. You can look out the window, and you can see individual people, and if the traffic is bad near the airport, at 600 meters, London or New York or Copenhagen isn't the place where the conference is. It isn't the spot on the map. It isn't where you're going next week. It's a place. It's all around you. Armstrong looks out that window at 600 meters, and for the first time in human history, the moon is no longer that light up in the sky. It's not this geopolitical Cold War thing we're fighting over. It's not this thing he's been training for years. It's a place. It's all around him. He can look down and he can see the ground scrolling beneath him, and there's rocks and cracks and hills. He can look in the distance and there's mountains, and the mountains are way higher than he is. Now, when I was a kid, I used to try to imagine what it would be like, right? You're in this bulky spacesuit, you've got this glass helmet on, you are looking out that window. Like, what would go through your mind? Armstrong didn't really talk a lot. Nobody really knows what went through his mind. But if it were me, I know exactly what would go through my mind, and the word is fear. The moon is a place. It's the wrong place. Armstrong knows exactly what he should see when he looks out that window. They took photographs, they made maps, they made plaster models. He knows exactly what he should see, and this is not it. And then it gets worse, because on that window, there are these markings, and he can do a quick calculation and then line his eye up and look down to see where the computer is taking them to land. So he does that, does some calculations, lines his eye up, and he sees this, a very geologically interesting crater. And the crater's not that big. The crater's not that big, but remember what a crater is. A big rock came down from the sky. Boom! There is stuff all over the place, stuff in the form of automobile-sized boulders, right? So you got this crater and you got this boulder field. Armstrong looks at that for just a few seconds, and then he makes a very Neil Armstrong decision. He disengages the computer and starts flying manually, and he does two things. They had been falling very rapidly, but he slows their fall, so they're just now slowly sinking. He does this, and then he zooms forward, because he thinks he can see, out past the crater, out past the boulders, he thinks he can see a relatively flat, relatively boring place to land, and he has got to get there before they run out of fuel. Back at Mission Control, all this data is streaming down. They can see Armstrong turn off the computer. They can see him slow the descent. They can see him zooming forward. The one thing they can't see is the crater. This is 1969. There's no live video feed. But what they can see, the one extra thing they can see, is Armstrong's heart rate skyrocket. Clearly, something is up. The reaction of those people in that room to this emergency is extraordinary. What they do is nothing. And in fact, the guy running the show in that room, a guy named Gene Kranz, tells everyone in the room, I don't want anybody talking to the astronauts anymore. Just relay up one bit of information periodically. How much time do they have before they run out of fuel? It is 16:14, 9 minutes into that last 10 minutes of flight. Armstrong and Aldrin have sunk down to about 100 meters. They're down to 5% of their fuel, and they are screaming across the surface of the moon. They've left the crater behind. The boulders are flashing by, and Armstrong is sure now, yeah, there's a relatively flat place I can land out there if I can just get past these boulders. They are going so fast that their speedometer is off the scale high. No one ever imagined they'd be going this fast, this close to the moon. But the boulders are going by, and they're getting closer. It is 16:16, 11 minutes into that last 10 minutes of flight down to the moon. They're now past the boulders. They're down to 10 meters, and Armstrong is putting on the brakes, trying to get it to stop so he can lower it straight down for the last few meters. It's right around now that they get the first ominous warning from the ground. It's just 2 words, 60 seconds. You have 1 minute of fuel left. Armstrong barely hears them because now he's got the thing stopped and he's lowering it down towards the ground. But at this point, they can't see the ground anymore. Their rocket engine is close enough to the ground that it's blowing up this huge cloud of dust. But the ground is down there somewhere. He knows the ground is down there. And it's right around now that they get the second warning. Again, it's just 2 words, 30 seconds. For God's sake, land this thing. Aldrin looks out the window, and he reports he can see a big shadow. It is the shadow of the spaceship on the ground. They are really close now. And then Aldrin looks down at his instrument panel, and there's a little amber light. And it's labeled lunar contact. The astronauts call it the contact light. And as he looks at it, it comes on. Contact light means that the landing gear of that weird-looking spaceship has touched something solid. Contact light means that they've landed. Contact light means that these 2 guys are not going to die, and better, they're not going to fail. Contact light means that Armstrong and Aldrin, that those people at Mission Control, that NASA, that humanity has arrived. It is 16:17:41. But Armstrong and Aldrin are not quite done. The plan had been to fly to about 1 meter above the moon and turn off the rocket engine and just let it fall the rest of the way. They were too busy not dying to do that. So now they're sitting on the moon, burning the last of their fuel, kind of the thing is hopping around a little bit, and they need to shut down this very complicated machine that still has some explosives left in it very carefully. So they have a checklist, and they run through the checklist together. They pair astronauts. So Armstrong starts by, he says, shut down, and then Aldrin says, okay, engine stop, ACA out of detent, and they go through this long technical shutdown checklist. Meanwhile, back at Mission Control, well, all this data is streaming down. They can see their version of the contact light, and they can see the systems going off, and they can hear Armstrong and Aldrin going through the shutdown checklist. And you would think that at a moment like this, someone would say something profound and historic. That's not really how people are. The guy on the ground radios up, words to the effect, "We think you landed." Really? Armstrong doesn't even respond to that. He's still on the last item of the shutdown checklist. He says, engine arm off. And then he says the words. He says the words that he wanted to be the first words from another world. He says, Houston, Mission Control's in Houston, Texas. Tranquility Base here. They had landed in a place on the moon called the Sea of Tranquility. Armstrong is making the point that this is the first outpost on another world. The Eagle, that's the actual name of the little spaceship, has landed. And with those words, this room full of nerdy engineers with their suit jackets and their ties, their pocket protectors, stand up and start shouting. There is certainly some shouting going on in those cars. Like, what would you do, right? You're in one of those cars, you're pulled off to the side of the road, maybe pound on the steering wheel, shout until your throat hurts, and then look around to see if anybody's watching you. There was certainly some shouting going on in that house in Philadelphia. Takes the 10-year-old boy just like half a second to realize they've done this. They've really did it. And then the boy realizes that his dad is no longer down like this, but his dad is jumping up and shouting louder than he's ever heard his dad shout before. And then the boy realizes it's not just his dad that's shouting. It's the people next door. It's the people on the other side. It's the people across the street. The whole neighborhood is shouting. And it's the kind of noise that you don't actually hear so much as you feel in your stomach. And it comes in waves. It'll be trailing off, and you think it's going to end, and then it just gets really loud again. And amidst all the shouting, the boy focuses back on the TV and sees the second incredible thing of the day. Because there on TV, just for a second, the camera cut away, but he saw it. It was there. He saw it. He did. He saw Walter Cronkite crying. So that's my story. Thank you. Thank you. And you know, I've told this story most of my adult life in one form or another, and I always say that, hey, I have this story, and I just said it, that's my story. It's as much your story as it is mine, right? If you live and breathe technology, if you just marvel at beautiful technical things, then this story is as much yours as it is mine. But I did say I was going to try and make the case that the story has things to teach us about software engineering. So let me try and do that. And I think there are little things we can learn from this story and great big things. But one of the little things that we can learn from this story is that in a complex technological system, a complex team effort to build microservices or landing on the moon machinery, little things can kill you. Right? Let's talk about all of the things that went wrong in that last 10 minutes down to the moon. And I will give you a hint. Each one of them was caused by something little. Why did their radio fail them for 5 critical minutes? Well, for that, we need to talk about steering rockets again. All right, remember the steering rockets? Well, the good news is the steering rockets on this thing worked fine, right? The problem was that a few months before Apollo 11 took off, the engineers behind this weird-looking machine got worried that the steering rockets might actually burn through the skin of this thing. This wildly irregular shape meant that some of the steering rockets were aimed at the spaceship. So they put these little shields on the spaceship, just pieces of sheet metal to keep the rocket engines from burning through the spaceship. Shields worked brilliantly, the steering rockets worked brilliantly, but the shields reflected the radio signals, and at certain angles, it would screw up their communications. Just happened to be that the angles were between minutes 10 and 5 of trying to land on the moon. Little things can kill you. Why did their computer crash, right? You can imagine, this was pretty thoroughly tested software. Why did it crash? Well, the thing was that that computer had 3 modes. There was a mode which was watch the mothership for when they were coming back up, right? Just pay attention to the mothership. How close are we to the mothership? What's the relative speed? There was a second mode, which was watch the ground, and that was the mode it was supposed to be in. How close are we to the ground? How fast are we going relative to the ground? The mode that it was actually in was watch both of them, and that the computer could not keep up, and it began to glitch. Little things can kill you. Piece of sheet metal in the wrong place, a switch in the wrong setting. Why were they off course? They had this brilliantly boring landing site picked out. Why were they off course? Well, for that, we need to go back a couple of hours to when these 2 spaceships were hooked together. When they were hooked together, there was a sort of tunnel that the people could use to pass back and forth. And when they were getting ready to separate, they'd close the hatch on one side, close the hatch on the other, and create sort of this dead space. And they were supposed to pump the air out of the dead space. And, I guess they had other things on their mind. They didn't quite get all of the air out of the dead space. So when the 2 ships separated, there was a puff of air that changed the speed of the lander by 1.3 kilometers per hour. What possible difference could 1.3 kilometers per hour make in a thing going 2,000 kilometers per hour? Well, do the math. It's 1.3 kilometers per hour times 2 hours. That's 2.6 kilometers, right? Or the distance between a nice geologically boring landing site and the crater of death. Right. One of the other things that this can teach us is something about trust, particularly if you work in a team. I think most of us work in a team, right? The thing that can save you when things go wrong is trust, right? You need to trust your teammates. Think of mission control. when Armstrong starts doing all this crazy stuff. He disengaged the computer. He's flying manually. What the heck is going on? Their reaction was to trust him because he was the person on the spot who knew what was going on. I hope you won't be offended when I say this, but I think sometimes software engineers, we could do better by shutting up and trusting our teammates if they're the people who have the information, the best information to do the job. We'd also learn something about leadership, and in particular, the difference between a leader and a hero, right? This is the iconic photo of that day, taken a few hours after the landing. And as an American, as a human being, right, this is a very heroic photograph. And that's the problem with it. It looks like it was easy. It looks like it was flawless, right? It looks like there were some smart people. They put a machine together. They flew to the moon. It was not a big deal. It was not difficult. We know that it was a struggle every step of the way, right? What I like better than this photograph is the shutdown checklist, right? These are the words of two people trying to finish the job at the end of a very long day. There's something else I like about these words. If you read these words, they are in our language. This is technical jargon. When you went to the talks today or yesterday, you heard words like this, right? This is the language of people dealing with complex systems. This is the language of engineers, technologists. These are your words and my words. You know what else these words are? These are the first words actually spoken from another world. I like that they're real. I like that they're the words of people trying to do something. I really like that there are words. And that kind of brings me to the bigger lessons of that day. And one of the bigger lessons is that when you build something technically beautiful, right, you cannot predict the side effects from that. And the best example I can think of that is a funny thing happened on the way to the moon. A funny thing happened. We looked back. We looked over our shoulder, and we saw our place in the universe. I know for most of you, pictures like this, they're just part of the wallpaper. You've seen them 1,000 times. They put them on T-shirts and nobody pays any attention. I would like for you to try to imagine that you had gotten to a certain point in your life having never seen a picture like that. And one day somebody comes and puts it down in front of you. What would go through your mind? What would you think? I can tell you. First thing is, well, that's the moon, but what's that thing above it? And then it hits you, and you think, oh my God, that's everything. That's all we've ever known. That is all of us. That is every birthday, that is every first day of school, it's every math test, it's every graduation, it's every teenage infatuation, it's every first date, it's every marriage or partnership, it's every anniversary, it's every funeral, it's every birthday. It's all we've ever had. It's home. It's beautiful. It is out there in the black and it's tiny. And then it hits you. And maybe we should take care of it. There is no greater irony than Apollo, this massive Cold War, semi-military, high-tech thing, helped give us Earth Day. You just look at the picture and it comes to you. And that kind of brings me to what I think of as the biggest lesson of that Sunday afternoon. And it is something I have a hard time putting into words. It's mostly, I think of it as a conversation. Maybe you and I go out to lunch. And maybe during lunch, one of us has an idea, right? Maybe you want to get rich mining minerals from the sea floor. Maybe I want to deliver pet food with drones. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what the idea is. Doesn't matter who had it. Now, maybe during lunch you decide that you don't like the idea, and you're trying to argue me out of it. So you might say, hey, Russ, this is not going to be worthwhile. This is going to be more trouble than it's worth. And sure, I'd believe that. Or you could say, hey, this is not going to make any money, right? We'll go bankrupt trying to do this, and I could certainly believe that. The one thing you cannot tell me, I just won't believe it, is that it is not possible. I'm familiar with the impossible. I saw it done on TV when I was a kid. The ultimate lesson of that day is that when you build something technically beautiful, well, congratulations, you have the thing. Maybe you'll get rich. But there is the second effect that goes out from it. It's like a wave. It is a wave of belief. You make people believe. You make people believe in the possibilities. If she can do that, maybe I can do something. You make people believe in themselves. If he can do that, I can do something. You make people believe. I know this for a fact. I know this for a fact because I am the result of one of those waves. I am a child of Apollo. I sat on that couch and my life changed. It got off of whatever path it had been on, and it got on a different path, a path that led me to science and the university and engineering, and a little bit after that to computer programming, a little bit after that to writing books, and about a minute after that to being here with you tonight. The ultimate lesson of Apollo really has very little to do with space travel or rockets or any of the rest of that, and it has everything to do with belief. So why do we do this? We do it because it's fun when it's not infinitely frustrating. We do it because it's worth doing. We do it because people are depending on us. But we also do it because we owe it to the next bunch of 10-year-olds. So for me, it all goes back to the words that started it all those years ago. We choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. So I hope you're enjoying the conference. I hope you have a great day tomorrow. I hope you have a safe trip home. And when you get home, from the bottom of my heart, I hope that you choose to do something hard. Thank you all. You've been a great audience.